Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and I am the host of this podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I am also a newly minted USA Today bestselling author of the novel Blank. I've created a whole community of book lovers around this podcast, a publishing company, reading retreats, a bookstore, and more. Learn more at zibbymedia.com or follow me on social at Zibby Owens or join the community at Zibby Readers. Graham Moore is the author of The Wealth of Shadows, a novel. Graham is the New York Times bestselling author of The Holdout, The Last Days of Night, oh my gosh, that was so good, and The Sherlockian, and the Academy Award-winning screenwriter of The Imitation Game, for which he also won a Writers Guild of America award. By the way, my brother Teddy Schwarzman produced that movie, The Imitation Game, and if you want to watch a conversation between Graham and Teddy instead of between Graham and me, you can do so on our YouTube channel at Zibbyverse, because they did an event together at Zibby's Bookshop recently. Graham is also the director and co-writer of The Outfit, which was nominated for a British Independent Film Award. Graham was born in Chicago, received a BA in Religious History from Columbia University, and currently lives in Los Angeles. Welcome, Graham. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss The Wealth of Shadows. Congratulations.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting with me.
My pleasure. I posted about your book this morning, actually, although this will come out later, this episode. I am so taken with your story. I've been a fan of yours for a long time after reading your last book and, you know, my brother Teddy, who produced The Imitation Game and everything. So I've been sort of following you from afar, and you're just so good. You're just such a great writer. And anyway, it was really
that's so kind of you. Don't tell your brother that you think that. He'll tell it to me, and it'll get in my head, and I'll blush, and it'll be way too much. So it'll be our secret. But those are kind words, and I appreciate it.
Okay, no problem. Can you tell listeners what The Wealth of Shadows is about, and also how you decided to write this book?
Sure. The Wealth of Shadows is based on a true story about a man named Ansel Luxford, who basically no one has ever heard of, which is part of why I wanted to write this book about him. In 1939, as the war in Europe broke out and the US was kind of assiduously neutral in this matter of European conflict, Ansel Luxford was a tax attorney in St. Paul, Minnesota, who felt that the United States was sort of profoundly not taking the Nazi threat seriously enough. But he was a tax attorney. What could he do? Well, what he did was he ended up joining a clandestine team of economists at the US Treasury Department who were tasked with this top secret mission to crash the Nazi economy. He was sort of a wild tale of this very ordinary guy who sort of found himself deep in a world of espionage and skullduggery in the dawning days of the Second World War. And when I found the story, I couldn't believe I'd never heard it before. I mean, I'd sort of started reading about the economic history of the war. And honestly, I sort of found this guy because I was flipping through kind of various books about I was really interested in the economic warfare between the Americans and the Germans in World War II. I felt that was something that I hadn't really read about before, this kind of like a shadow war underneath the sort of war of armies and the airplanes and tanks and bullets we've all kind of heard about. And I just kept reading about this one guy who just kept showing up at these meetings. It was like I'd read these meeting minutes, and here was Ansel Luxford in a meeting with the president. Here was Ansel Luxford in a meeting in London. Here was Ansel Luxford at a conference in Havana. And I kept going, who is this person? What's his story? Have I never heard of him before? So I started digging. No obituaries had ever been published about him. No one seemed to have written about him at all. And after a few months, I finally found his children, all three of whom are still with us today. And I remember finding his daughter, and I got her on the phone, and she said, I explained who I was and what I wanted to do. And I think at first she thought I was a scammer or something, like I was trying to get credit card numbers out of her. Because I'm a novelist and filmmaker from Los Angeles, and I want to write this thing about your father. And she was sort of going, yeah, this sounds shady. I don't know. I had to like send her photos of me to prove, no, this is me, and these are my books, and I really am this person. And then she kind of said, oh, wait, I don't understand. So you want to write a book about my father, but no one's ever heard of him. And I said, yes, that's why I want to write a book about your father. And then I found my way to, she put me in touch with her brothers, and Ansel Luxford's youngest child he's a sheep herder in rural Montana. It took me months to get him on the phone. He lives off the grid. You can only connect him via satellite phone. It was, as you might imagine, a whole experience to get him on the line. The satellite phone only connects at certain times. I had to call like once a week. There's a window where you can get him. I finally got him. I was so excited to speak to him, and I get him on the line, and he says, "Oh, my sister told me you'd be calling. She said you might want to write a novel about my father." And I said, "Yeah, I think I do." And he said, I've been waiting for this phone call my whole life. Is this about how my dad was secretly a spy?" And I paused for a long moment, and I think I said, "Well, it is now. So let's talk about it." And that's where I think the story that I found of Ansel Luxford got even stranger and more interesting.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And what about the other kids?
They were great. It was great I mean, it's strange, right, to interview children and say, "Hey, I'm gonna write a novel based on the life of your father, and it's about your mother and about their relationship, and their marriage is a big part of the book." And obviously anyone is a little weirded out to talk to someone and say, "So you're writing a novel about my parents' marriage? How do I feel about this? Like, what am I going to talk about?" But they were great. They've been so supportive. It was interesting hearing debates among the children about whether was dad really a spy? How much of a spy was dad? They have different, like all families, they debate the history, right? And they have different views. And one of the kids says, "Oh no, he wasn't a spy. He kept taking all these business trips to Cairo in the early 50s. But no, he was just a tax lawyer." And you're kind of going, "Yeah, that's not a tax lawyer thing in 1951." But it was amazing to hear their stories and hear where they'd agree and then disagree. And I will confess that I was never more nervous to show the book to anyone than to the children when I was finished, and sort of sending them this novel and saying, here's a novel, here's a piece of historical fiction I've written, very much based on the lives of your father and mother. And I will say my most gratifying moment on finishing the book came when his daughter read it, and she called me and said, what did she say? She said, "I will confess, it was a little weird for me at first to read a novel about my parents' marriage, but I love it, and you really capture them, and I'm so supportive of this." And it was really, it meant the world to me to hear that they've been so supportive of the book.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, the book does have such strong characters, right? So you, like in any novel, you feel very invested and your emotions are tied up with them and you're rooting for them and rooting against them and all the things. But you also have so much interesting backstory. And I am not someone who is particularly interested in economics. I took it once and I went to business school, so I had to take some classes. But this is not something that like I would choose to necessarily read about. But you've made it so interesting, almost like how you describe Ansel's ability to like turn his number charts into, beautiful narratives or whatever, however you described it. But some of the things that were going on between Germany and the other countries, from South America to the US to everywhere, and the shadow currency and the secret bank accounts of the German Jews in the US, and like all of these things like have blown my mind and that I did not realize were going on. And I don't know if maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I feel like this is part of the narrative that is definitely not, and maybe that's what you were referring to, but not in the popular vernacular of how another way that Jews were sort of stripped of their rights and things. I don't know. Tell me about how you discovered all this and what you knew, what you didn't know.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say all of that, because honestly, I knew none of this history going into it either. This is all new information to me. And you, per the description you just gave, I mean, you have more of a background in economics than I did going into this. I never took an economics class in college. I just had nothing, which is part of why I was interested in writing this. I think I keep sort of choosing these big topics that I know nothing about, so that I get to spend a bunch of time learning about them. Going into the Imitation Game, I knew very little about mathematics, so I had to learn a bunch. Going into this, I knew very little about economics. So that was really fascinating. It was obviously a little bit daunting to get my head around a lot of it, and I think there was a long research process, sort of learning the economic history of the war. And as you were saying, the so much of it was sort of a narrative of the war that I'd never heard before, especially the period between 1939 and 1941. I'm American, you're American. I think as Americans, we're sort of used to talking about World War One as this thing, or at least I'm used to talking about World War One or World War Two as this thing that started in December of 1941 with Pearl Harbor. And what the book is mostly about is the period the years before that, where the war in Europe was going on and the American government was saying, we're not picking sides. I mean, I didn't even know before getting into the book that the US had passed a sort of this neutrality law saying that the US government is in as late as 39, including after the invasion of Poland, the US had this law saying the federal government is not picking sides between Nazi Germany and Britain. We are not picking sides between Nazi Germany and France. I didn't even know that was the case before getting into the research process in the book. And that seemed sort of wild to me. And that was part of why this unit of economists at Treasury had to be so secretive, because what they were doing was very much illegal. They said, yes, we're officially neutral, but no, we're not doing that. And this threat is real and it's serious. And if we don't get involved now, we're certainly going to have to get involved later. So, but we're economists. So what can we do? Well, what we can do is hit the Germans in their wallets and try and really invent the concept of economic warfare. I mean, I think the sort of economic warfare that they invented was something that hadn't really existed prior. So it was a great process for me to sort of learn all of that. I think in some ways then, as you were talking about, you have to go write a book about it. You have to sort of explain some of these complicated concepts to readers. I guess I would say that I think readers are so much savvier than we often give audiences credit for being. Like, I really believe that readers are at least as smart as I am and can figure out, if I can come to understand these concepts, so can my readers. If someone as dumb as me can figure it out, I'm sure they'll be able to get their heads around it. It's deeply what I believe. And in some ways, when I'm kind of trying to get the readers inside the minds of these characters, Ansel and the other economists on his team, what I've always found is you can describe things. If the thing I'm describing is terribly important to the characters in the scenes, they'll become terribly important to the readers. Like, yes, some bit of kind of, I don't know, an arcane bit of how the German bond system worked might seem
Yes.
kind of it might seem kind of esoteric and inessential, but but to these characters, to Ansel Luxford and his teammates, this is the most important thing in the world. And the fate of human civilization hangs on this quirk of the German bond market. So there is nothing in the world more important to these characters than this point of economics. So when they're arguing about it, they're really arguing about it. And I think that kind of emotional way in really helps me sort of get first my head into some of these complicated concepts, and then I think the readers' heads into them as well. And honestly, because there was such a long research process for this book, when I'm describing these things, when I'm writing a year or two after having done this research, I'm always kind of telling myself, okay, how would I describe this to myself a year ago? Like, to me a year ago, who knew none of this, what's a description that I would have understood well enough to get the gist of this while continuing to move along? And then I will say, towards the latter stage of the book, finishing it, I had kind of three preeminent economists come in and read drafts and help correct some errors, and that was very nerve-wracking for me because I felt like I was a naughty student getting called into the principal's office, and they were going to correct my term papers and hadn't made any mistakes. And I was very flattered that, frankly, all three of them kind of said, this is shockingly accurate. This is so much more accurate than I expected it to be. And there were bits in here that I didn't even know. And that made me feel like I'd done my research pretty thoroughly and had figured out a way to communicate these complicated concepts in a way that was both accurate and had like emotional valence. Like, you're getting it through the characters, not just sort of, it's not just a history lesson. It's this period of American history as rendered through these people and the things that are on their minds.
Well, to that point, there are a couple times when one of the characters is describing something to someone else, like when they were describing the system to Moynihan or something, and I could see, and you're like, and then White says something like, "No, make it simpler, like cut," and I'm like, Did Graham Moore know that this was sounding a little confusing, and so he decided to like insert this so that he would make it more clear in the next paragraph, or what?
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, that was very much the point of that section. And we had in, Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, and he was the Treasury Secretary. He was Jewish. He was the only Jewish cabinet member. That becomes sort of a point in the book
Did I say
because
the
that was
wrong
difficult
name?
from.
I think I
Oh
said
yeah,
the
no, it was
wrong name. I'm
Morgenthau.
so sorry. Morgenthau,
No, it's fine.
not Morgenthau. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So this was interesting to me as well, that Morgenthau had as much of an economic background as I did when he became the Treasury Secretary. He had no background in economics whatsoever. He was just really good friends with the president. And nowadays, I think we expect our cabinet secretaries to be somewhat more, I don't know, qualified or educated than was the norm in the 1930s. But so when I realized how little background the Treasury Secretary had, it actually ended up being really helpful because there's the scene you're talking about where Ansel Luxford, our lead character, from whose perspective we're getting this whole story, is sort of led into Morgenthau's office and told, okay, you have to explain this really complicated concept to the Treasury Secretary, and basically, and if you don't do it, you're fired. Like your job is on the line here, and so he's struggling to explain it in a simple way, and Morgenthau keeps not quite getting it, and sort of as you're saying, being like, wait, sorry, that was simpler, and so yeah, that ended up being a great technique for getting information to an audience in a really like organic way. And it's always helpful when you have characters who genuinely wouldn't know some of this. So someone needs to go explain it to them to sort of get their heads around it. But also someone really smart. Like Morgenthau is he's asking smart questions about, wait, I don't go back because that didn't actually quite make sense to me. What's the point? Like he's a smart questioner and sort of probing Ansel into giving an even more succinct and also compelling explanation of this point of economics.
And funny too, when he's like, yeah, you think there are a lot of pork farmers and a lot of Jewish pork farmers out there? And he's like, oh, he's funny.
He is, but yeah, he tries to go. That was a really fun character to write. It's fun. And some of this story was really true. I mean, I think I was really interested in this idea that this team at Treasury basically went to Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary. He was the only Jewish cabinet secretary. He was very aware of that. And this becomes a point in the book where he's basically saying, more than other cabinet secretaries, I can't be seen to do anything to stop the Germans because I'm the only Jewish one. And if I'm the one who's doing this, it's going to seem like I'm biased or something. But this seems, from my research, very much the case. This team basically went to Morgenthau and said, hey, we know we have to be neutral. We know it's the law is we have to be neutral here, but that's not what we're going to do. And we're going to go do this thing. And you really want us to stop? And Morgenthau basically went to the president and said, this is going to happen. You and I don't know about it. And both Morgenthau and the president basically said, hands over my ears. Nah, I didn't hear that. Let's pretend this never happened. As long as it doesn't show up in the newspapers, we never know any of this. And what they do, what this group of people does is what this group of people is going to do. I mean, I think that's pretty remarkable that they had the good sense to pretend not to know what was really going on.
So you give us a glimpse into your process through the notes, which I found really entertaining in and of themselves. And I'm like, when is the last time I read notes? But the way you wrote the notes, it's like part of the book almost, like a coda. And in some of them, you explain why you move timelines and this and that. And then you were describing someone's marriage. I think whose marriage was it? Anyway, somebody's...
Oh, maybe John Maynard Keynes, yeah.
Yes. And you were like, he liked men, but he was in love with his wife, but this. And then you were like, whatever, like people are complicated. I was like, that's really funny. You know what I mean? Like that, you don't usually find that in the notes section. So the way you clearly have such a grasp on all the things enough to like really sort of massage details and timelines and everything. I can't even imagine like the note, like how did you accomplish this? Did you have stuff everywhere? Like, is this a visual thing for you? How did you do this? Or were you just moving things around in documents?
It's a really good question. And yeah, I think one of the techniques I use a lot in sort of historical fiction is kind of timeline reworking a little bit, sort of to re-narrativize, moving things around a little bit, simplifying timelines, something that takes place, something in the real world was like 3 meetings just turns into 1 meeting or 1 scene for the purpose of the novel. And so, yeah, so for a lot of that and for sort of figuring out the first question in the process is always, all right, so what's the real history? Let's try and really drill down on what really happened. And with something like this, what do we know happened? And then what are we just not sure about? Because
Mm-hmm.
for a story like this, so much of it was secret. There's just so much. There's just so much we don't know. There's so much that we don't have records for. And with this, what actually happened was, as I think I say in the author's note at the end of the book, I was doing this research and I found this wonderful scholar at the US Holocaust Museum. And I didn't even realize that they had these kind of resident scholars who are just sort of around to do research and help out. They have no teaching responsibilities. They have no publishing responsibilities. They're just they do some research. And I got her on the phone and said, hey, this is what I'm interested in. And I think she'd written some things that are kind of a bit related to this group at Treasury. And she said, oh, great. Yeah, sure. Happy to help you. Actually, I found this box in the basement of the Treasury Department a couple years ago. And this box had the only copy of a typed up history of this secret unit at Treasury written by them. They wrote this little history of what they'd done just for themselves as a sort of, we don't know if anyone's going to read this. We don't know if anyone's going to care. We don't know if we're going to win the war and any of us are going to be alive, to enjoy this little history years from now. But this is what happened. And they kind of wrote this and stuffed it into a box in the basement of the Treasury. And it was 700 pages long. And I'm on the phone with her and she's telling me, oh, yes, I found this box that's like written by the characters in your book. And it's their history from their perspective of what really happened. And no one's ever digitized it. There's just one copy sitting in the basement of the Treasury. But she says, her name was Rebecca Erbelding, the scholar. She's wonderful. Rebecca said, oh, but I took my cell phone and I snapped photographs of every page. Do you want me to send you the cell phone photos? And I said, yes, Rebecca, I do. And so the next day, 700 cell phone snapshots of individual pages of this history show up. And that was amazing because that was something, to my knowledge, no one else has ever seen these pages. They're like sitting on my phone right now because they're just these cell phone photos, right? They're like next to the pictures of my kids in a folder on my cell phone. And so going through that was really helpful because you're getting, okay, this is what happened according to them. But even, I mean, there's so much kind of espionage going on. Even some of that, I don't think they were being totally honest because I was working with one of my research assistants and we were kind of going through this one section where they're saying, oh, it was actually the bit that you were talking about a minute ago about sort of how the secret method by which the Nazis were confiscating the bank accounts of Jews around the world.
Yep.
And it just says, there's something in the text, I'm probably going to mangle the language somewhat, but it says in their history that they wrote, it says, well, information came to us that this was happening. So we decided to go and do X, Y, and Z. And I remember reading that and going, information came to you. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That sounds like espionage to me. And so even in this history, they're not being totally honest about what they're really doing and where they're really learning things and how they're really learning things. So I think in putting everything together, we tried to make these really, really detailed charts and timelines and sort of day-to-day timelines of what was really going on, getting as many photographs as possible. I really love the photographs of all the scenes, of all the where they were, the offices, the furniture store where they end up moving in to build their offices. And then sort of saying, okay, what do we want to focus on narratively? What can we kind of condense so the things we can smush together for simplicity's sake, the book was so, I think something that unites this book with, frankly, all my previous ones is I'm really interested in perspective. Like the books have these really, really precisely delineated perspectives. They're from one person's perspective. This book is from Ansel Luxford's perspective. It's a close third person narration. It's sort of inside his head the entire book, and we never see anything he doesn't see. We never learn anything he doesn't know. We never hear anything he doesn't hear. And so, in a way, a guide is sort of wrestling the history down into something understandable and something kind of traumatizable is, okay, well, what was his experience of it? Like, what was he there for? What were the events that were important to him? What were the bits, there's a bit in the book about the first time he's getting on a military plane to go to Havana for a sort of this secret conference that he has sort of a secret agenda at. And you're like, oh, right. From his perspective, 3 months ago, this guy was a tax attorney in St. Paul, Minnesota, and now he's on this military plane going to a secret conference with a secret agenda that he's trying to enact. That must have felt insane to him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a big point in the book. Like that must have just felt so. If you the goal is always kind of looking at from a place of like from a place of feeling, like what would feel the most important to him, and let's focus on those bits.
And he had never even left the country, although they were explaining it was a technicality, but still, yeah, crazy.
Yeah, no, I was trying to find, it seemed like he hadn't left the country before that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems so amazing, right? That he was just this really normal guy. I think that was part of the frankly, for me, like the autobiographical part of the book, that I was feeling like this kind of middle-aged dad in sort of like a happy, comfortable place in my career, but going, imagining, okay, if the end of the world, if this was 1939, if it felt like the end of the world was happening around me, what would I be able to do about it? Because I think Ansel Luxford very much felt the same way. I think it felt to him like the world was ending, and as a tax attorney, what could he do about it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it actually does almost feel like the world is ending right now. I mean, as this book is coming out, and Ansel, in your opening scene, he's looking at the march out the window of the trolley, and now we're in a time where there are marches like this all the time again, like it's all happening again, and your book like couldn't be better timed. I mean, yay for book marketing and timing and all of that, who would have known? But it's terrifying. It's terrifying, and I'd like to think that there is lots of groups of people working on trying to solve these bigger problems that we just don't know about. So I'm hoping that is occurring, but who knows?
From your lips to God's ears. Yeah, one hopes. It is funny. I mean, I started the book, in early 2020. And so a lot of these sort of things the things on the front pages of newspapers just hadn't happened yet. And so it almost became this grim sort of joke as we were working on it, where, the invasion of Ukraine happens. And then, I'm on the phone with my editor, and we're kind of going, oh gosh, she even made a joke, like, were you trying to be this topical? And I was kind of going, no, I really didn't think this was topical at all. And then here we are. But I think, maybe that was one of the things that was also interesting to me, is that these questions are not questions we ever put aside. Like the moral questions facing people in 1939 are not moral questions that have left us. They're moral questions that confront all of us still, and will confront all of us 100 years from now in different forms. And I think it's something I like about historical fiction, is that I get to write about 1939, but excise all of my own anxieties and fears and thoughts about 2024.
Yeah, and that is nice. Hopefully this is not in the same way, like a preamble to a giant war, but we'll see what happens.
Let's hope we don't quite get there. Yeah.
Well, we'll just keep reading your book and, see what happens next in our world. I know we have to go now, but I just want like a quick thing. What was it like to win an Academy Award? Like, was that just amazing to go on stage? Like, just what was that moment like for you?
Oh, it was great. It was such a delight. It's funny. It was wonderful. I think it's funny. I think sometimes friends of mine will ask me that question and will expect me to reveal some kind of like dark underbelly of, be careful what you wish for. No, don't be careful what you wish for. It was great. It was so much fun. My mom was my date. We got to go to all the parties afterwards. I have a photograph that remains on my phone of my mother at 3 a.m. that night in her gown in my hotel room. Like, she's sitting on the floor of my hotel room eating popcorn and just staring at the gold trophy in her hands. Aww. And the fact that my mom was up at 3 a.m. tells you all you need to know about what that night must have been like for us. No, but it was this tremendous thing. And I think while unexpected, it was sort of gratifying and fun. And it was both a lovely moment, frankly, for everyone on that film. I think we all got to sort of celebrate it together. I think, as your brother knows, like we made it sort of quickly, and it was all very like harried, and we were sort of, everyone was doing their best, and we didn't have a lot of time to sort of, while we were making it, we didn't have a lot of time to like sit back and relax and have a glass of wine together and, tell stories and get to know each other. We were all sort of work. And so then kind of getting to go to the Academy Awards together and getting to celebrate together, it felt for the team as if like, oh, okay, we can finally get to enjoy each other as human beings for a little bit, and we like each other very much. But no, it was, I think that trophy itself remains something that was a good confidence booster for me, of sort of like pick the stories that I really care about, go write those stories, and hopefully there will be people out there who are as entranced by these tales as much as I am.
Amazing. Well, I have a million more questions, but if I ever try to steal someone's iPhone to check out their photos, it will clearly be yours, is basically what I'm taking away from this conversation. Anyway, congratulations. Thank you so much. And yeah, best of luck with everything.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you love it, please leave a review and follow us on social at Zibby Owens and at Zibby Readers.